connective tissue. Connective tissue is one of the most abundant tissues that we have in our body. There are multiple different tissues that are going to be included in this category, such as fibrous tissue, adipose tissue, cartilage, bone, and blood. Since we have all these different tissues in our body, that provides all these different functions. For example, binding of organs, that's the fibrous tissue. Support, physical protection, that would be bones. Immune protection, that would be the blood. You know that tissues are made of cells, so therefore we are supposed to find multiple different types of cells. And you have in here fibroblasts. You're going to find it in the fibrous tissue. You have macrophages in blood, leukocytes also in blood. Fibrous connective tissue. The fibrous connective tissue refers to this type of connective tissue that is going to connect things. The cell in this tissue is going to be the fibroblast. These cells are going to produce fibers. The fibers are going to be collagen fibers, elastic fibers, and reticular fibers. As you can understand, not all the cells in our body are exactly 2 inches by 2 inches by 2 inches, but rather they have certain shape that resemble to be like a cube, for example, but they are not exactly a cube. Therefore, when you put together these cells in your body, there's going to be multiple areas where there's going to be spaces in between because the cells are not exactly 2 by 2 by 2. These spaces are filled by ground substance, which is also part of the connective tissue because it connects all these different areas where there are voids or spaces in between cells. What is the ground substance composed of? Glycosaminoglycans, proteoglycans, and adhesive glycoproteins. Based on the number of fibers, remember we said that the fibrous connective tissue has fibers, you're going to have 2 main types. If you have just a few fibers in that tissue, that's going to be called loose connective tissue. If you have a lot of fibers, it's going to be called dense connective tissue. Let's talk about the loose connective tissue. We're going to see some figures. Okay, you can see here the fibers, for example, in black. There's just a few fibers because you can even see through them. You see that? There's spaces in between them. And in here you have the areolar connective tissue because in here you can see also the fibers. But there's a whole bunch of spaces, right? So there's not a lot of fibers. That's why this is called loose connective tissue. If we scroll down, we're going to see the other type, which is dense connective tissue. Dense connective tissue, we have 2 main kinds. One of them is going to be regular, and the other one is going to be dense irregular. The characteristic is that the dense regular is going to have some pattern with respect to the fibers, either from left to right or right to left. But in the case of dense irregular, it has no pattern whatsoever, but a lot of fibers. That's why it's called dense connective tissue. Adipose tissue has main jobs, such as, for example, producing insulation, energy storage, and there are 2 main kinds. The ones that adults have, white fat, and the other one is called brown fat. This is the one that newborns have.
Supportive connective tissue, bone, and cartilage.
Cartilage is a tissue, and like any other tissue, is going to have cells. What cells you have in there? Chondroblast. Eventually, the chondroblast turns into a chondrocyte. Now, there are 3 kinds of cartilage. You have hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. The next topic is going to be bone. Bone is a tissue, therefore you have to know the cell. The cell is going to be the osteoblast, and the osteoblast eventually is going to turn into an osteocyte. There are 2 types of bones, spongy bone and compact bone. This black dot that you see right here, that's where the osteoblast and eventually the osteocyte is going to be found. Blood has a whole bunch of cells. It has multiple different functions.
Red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets.
Remember, we said that we have 4 primary tissues: epithelial, connective, nerves, and muscle. Again, since this is tissue, you need to know the cells that you have in the nerves. So for the nerves tissue, the cells are going to be neurons and neuroglia. This is an example of a neuron. There are 3 kinds of muscles. The muscles are going to be cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and skeletal muscle. Okay, the next topic is cell junctions, glands, and membranes. So let's take a look at this. Cell junctions are connections in between the cells. You can see here the cell junctions. The main cell junctions are tight junctions, desmosomes, gap junctions, and hemidesmosomes. So these cell junctions not only allows the cells to get together, but it has other functions, such as, for example, these ones look like pores. It allows things to go through between cells. glands. Exocrine glands are the ones that are going to produce something, for example, sweat, and they're going to secrete this to the exterior. All the exocrine glands are going to have two main parts, an acinus and a duct. The acinus is the area where the substance is produced, for example, sweat, and the duct is the tube that takes the contents to the outside. Most of the time when we talk about outside, we are talking about the skin. Exocrine glands can be classified in multiple different ways. Unicellular, they're just made of one cell, or multicellular, multiple cells. An example of unicellular, for example, is goblet cells. This is not the only way that you can classify glands. You can also classify them by the type of tube and the type of acinus. If the type of acinus is like a tube like this, it's going to be tubular. If it's just one duct, it's going to be called simple. That's why this was called simple tubular. Now, if the acinus is like a balloon, it's alveolar. And if it has multiple branches, it's compound, like in this case. Another way you can classify the glands is in the way they secrete, the way they release the contents. For that, you have merocrine glands, apocrine glands, and holocrine glands. You can see them right here. In merocrine glands, the glands produce the contents, and they release them by exocytosis. They just open and they release the contents. In the case of apocrine glands, they produce the substance, but at the end, once they release it, parts of the cell membrane, they surround the contents and they are released together with the parts of the cell membrane. In the case of holocrine glands, they produce the contents, but the cell produces so much of this that the cell actually explodes. And then the contents are released with pieces of the cell that exploded. That's a holocrine gland. Membranes. We have mucous membranes and serous membranes. Serous membranes have two layers, the parietal layer and the visceral layer. In between the two layers, you're going to have a fluid. This fluid is called the serous fluid. An example of a serous membrane is a membrane that covers the heart. The particular name for that membrane is going to be the pericardium. This fluid, in the case of the pericardium, is going to be called the pericardial fluid. Mucous membrane. Mucous membranes are the membranes that cover areas that we have in our body that have contact with the exterior. For example, in our mouth. The inside of our mouth is not the same as the skin that we have in our face, because the inside of our mouth is going to be a mucous membrane. There's another membrane called cutaneous membrane. This cutaneous membrane is the part of your skin.